The finding. At 7:43 in the evening of an October Tuesday, the call reached Kensington Palace. A breach of protocol, the failure to knock, sensitized William to an impending catastrophe as he reviewed briefing materials for the engagement scheduled for the following day. He had an urgent matter that could not be discussed over the normal palace lines and required an instant meeting with the archivist at Balmoral Castle. Margaret Thornhill had spent 30 years overseeing the family's historical collections, and William was linked to her through secure channels within minutes. Margaret was not the kind to become agitated quickly, but William had never heard her voice tremble like that before. She had kept documents that most people would never know existed, seen correspondence chronicle royal scandals over generations, and cataloged everything from medieval manuscripts to Queen Victoria's notebooks. However, she broke convention and demanded to speak with the Prince of Wales right away after being so shocked by what she discovered that afternoon. The finding had occurred nearly by chance. In a storage room that hadn't been thoroughly surveyed since the 1950s, Margaret was sifting through a stack of boxes. Household accounts, personnel records, and routine administrative files from the reign of George V/VI made up the majority of the contents, as indicated by the superficial labels. Something was strange, though, in a closed cabinet behind a labeled Private 1940 to 1942 box. Margaret quickly recognized the handwriting within as that of the Duke of Windsor, the former Edward VII, who had abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. There were dozens of letters written in this hand. However, these reporters were not the sanitized versions found in government records. It became apparent to Margaret as she read that these were secret letters that had been hidden on purpose, taken out of the main collection, and kept separately for reasons that would become apparent later on. In the early years of World War II, while Edward was living in exile, the letters documented talks that he had engaged in, having discussions with people whose names chilled Margaret to the bone. Nazi sympathizers, high-ranking German officials, and others who had been trying to broker an independent peace that would have given Hitler control of continental Europe and kept Britain neutral. The letters weren't technically treacherous because Edward could be returned to the throne with German support. There was no longer any legal obligation for Edward to be loyal to the king. Historians had long suspected uncomfortable Nazi inclinations, but this revelation showed a degree of cooperation and negotiation that was significantly deeper. Edward had done more than just make controversial remarks or pose for photos with German authorities. Concerning the shape of post-war Europe under Nazi leadership, preparations for his return to power, and the possible surrender of Britain were all topics in which he had participated extensively. The letters also showed that he wasn't acting alone. Members of the wider royal family, statesmen, and aristocrats who had shared Edward's rebellious beliefs and taken part in these discussions cropped up more than once. Some of those names are associated with individuals whose descendants continue to hold significant positions in British politics. Realizing she had fallen into something that exceeded standard archiving protocol, Margaret stopped reading after the first dozen letters. There was no interest in the past here. It was a ticking time bomb that, if detonated, might shatter lives, alter the course of history, and undermine the monarchy's credibility. Just as quickly as she had relocked everything in the cabinet, she had departed from the storage room and called William's office. Knowing this would help him make a decision about what to do with information that had been purposefully kept secret for more than 8 decades, which was crucial for him as the heir to the throne. William felt his anxiety rise as he listened to Margaret explain everything. "Is anyone else aware of this?" he inquired. She verified that she had spared no one the sight of the letters, kept their existence a secret, retrieved them without delay, and communicated with only William. He told her to keep quiet and to carry the whole box to the safest vault in the castle. Before deciding what to do with the papers, he would rush to Balmoral to have a look at them in person. For a few minutes after the call ended, William did nothing but sit and think about what he had just heard. It has been known for decades that the Duke of Windsor had Nazi sympathies. His troubling remarks during the war, his encounter with Hitler in 1937, and his dubious political beliefs have all been covered in great detail by historians. This, however, seemed unique. This went beyond merely having sympathetic beliefs or having bad judgment. During Britain's darkest hour, this was overt cooperation with those who were actively working against the country's interests. Historical perspectives on the abdication crisis and the war years would be drastically changed if the letters included Margaret's suggestions. It would be revealed by them that the monarchy had taken in traitors, or at least individuals who were considering betraying the faith. Depending on who else was mentioned in the letters, The revelations could harm or kill current individuals whose sole transgression was being associated with historical personalities who made disastrous decisions 80 years ago, thereby dismantling the meticulously preserved storyline that the royal family had united against Nazism and that Edward's abdication had been motivated solely by marriage rather than politics. There was no way William could make this call on his own. He had to examine the paperwork for himself, had to grasp the whole extent and consequences of them. It was imperative that he act swiftly and covertly before anyone else became aware of this finding. The window of opportunity to manage this data was small and quickly shrinking. During their half-term holiday, Catherine and the children spent time at Windsor. William contacted her right away, merely informing her that he had to fly to Scotland tonight due to an important matter. On the phone, he was unable to give specifics, but he promised to return and clarify everything. Catherine should not have pressed the issue. Real crisis, not just any old palace emergency, was what William meant when he adopted that tone. He required urgent transportation to Balmoral, according to William's security detail. The only thing mentioned was that there was an immediate family issue that needed to be addressed personally. Since royal plans might alter at a moment's notice, they started making preparations for the helicopter that would transport him from Kensington to RAF Nordholt, where an aircraft was waiting to transport him to Aberdeen. 2 personal assistants with top-secret clearances who were used to dealing with classified information made up his small team that his private secretary put together. Along with William, they would travel to Scotland to review the paperwork and provide an evaluation of the issue. Nobody else had to be informed. No, not just yet. Maybe never. It all depends on the contents of those letters. William reflected on his great-great-uncle Edward as he got ready to depart. I was already aware with the formal history. A pleasant exile awaited Edward after he fell in love with a divorcee from the United States, abdicated, and put his own happiness ahead of his duty. His main failing had always been putting love ahead of kingship, although he had been portrayed in a variety of positive and negative light, from a romantic character to someone who had shirked responsibility. Is it possible that the whole story was a hoax? What if, during the war, Britain couldn't afford to have Edward on staff due to his political beliefs and links to the Nazis, and not just because of Wallace Simpson? Imagine instead that Hitler's invasion was imminent and the abdication was primarily motivated by a desire to remove a monarch with fascist tendencies from power. Historians had argued over these issues for decades, with most of them writing them off as conspiracy theories. William was now going to find out whether there was any proof in the documents to back up the most sinister version of events. Just after 9 o'clock, William was whisked away in the helicopter from Kensington to Balmoral, where a sealed cabinet held the terrible truth. Nordhall was reached after a 20-minute trip. William sat quietly on the 90-minute flight to Aberdeen, thinking about what he would discover and how he would put it to use once he got there. Certain findings could never go undetected. Some facts, once known, altered the course of events. William knew that in the next several hours he would learn a secret about his family's past that may haunt him forever. A poisonous secret that had been kept for 8 decades was abruptly revealed during an archaeologist's usual inventory work. Only a few minutes before midnight did the plane start descending into Aberdeen. He would be driven the 50 miles to Balmoral in a vehicle that was waiting for him in the dark Scottish countryside. And in a secure vault at the castle, a stack of letters awaited their chance to show whether the monarchy that William would one day inherit had a more shaky basis than anyone had dared to recognize. Even though we only took 90 minutes to drive from Aberdeen to Balmoral in the dark, the trip felt much longer. As William sat in the rear of the Range Rover, he imagined what he would find as he watched the shadows move across the Scottish Highlands. Respectful quiet was maintained by his 2 assistants. Everything they knew was that the Prince of Wales had to attend to some pressing archival business right now. Once they arrived at the castle, the details would be disclosed. At midnight, Balmoral felt both familiar and unnerving. William had spent innumerable vacations here, was familiar with all of the rooms and hallways, and had pleasant memories of summertime get-togethers with family and friends. The castle took on a new identity as we approached it tonight, on a clandestine nighttime mission to investigate ancient records that could contain explosive material. A hidden chamber where unsettling realities have been concealed for ages. Standing anxiously and visibly fatigued by the main entrance was Margaret Thornhill. In the 5 hours after their call, she had spent more time studying the papers, and her worries had grown as a result of what she had seen. Following her, William and his aides were brought to the castle's basement, where the most secret documents were kept in a climate-controlled archive room. The seemingly harmless package rested on an examination table. Regular archival storage, perhaps 18 by 12 by 8 inches. The historical bombshell it seemed to contain was completely concealed by its outward appearance. Margaret had done nothing to alter its condition other than move it from the unlocked storage room to this protected area. She had not taken anything else. William knew he couldn't undo what he learned once he glanced inside, so he approached the table gently. Prior to opening it, Margaret provided background information. The crate was either intentionally disguised or had been labeled incorrectly. A private from 1940 to 1942 was the only information provided by the outside marking, which did not reveal the author or the content. It had been tucked away under other boxes, and getting to it required rearranging a number of other containers. The fact that she was conducting the first thorough cleaning of that storage space in 70 years was the sole reason she discovered it. The enclosed letters were arranged in chronological order, beginning in June 1940 and ending in November 1942. With a few copies of replies thrown in, the most were letters written by Edward to different correspondents. Someone evidently saw their historical value and the threat they posed and decided to keep them safe. Someone had stashed them away instead of destroying them, which could have been the more prudent thing to do. This could have been due to a belief that they could one day need to be exposed or the inability to destroy any correspondence from a previous monarch, no matter how sensitive. William pulled the first letter from the box with great care, donning the cotton gloves used by archivists to handle delicate manuscripts. The date was June 20th, 1940, which was very close to the time when France capitulated to Germany. Edward was composing his message from Lisbon, having escaped from France with Wallace in the nick of time before the German onslaught. Edward had known the German official before the war, and he was the recipient. Despite the fact that Britain and Germany were at war, the letter had a casual, almost pleasant tone. Edward said that he thought it was foolish to keep fighting, that the British could never hope to defeat the Germans militarily, and that reasonable people on both sides should be trying to reach a peaceful resolution through negotiation. He implied that the present British administration, led by Churchill, was too rigid and clung to antiquated ideas of bravery and defiance. It's possible that several leaderships may arrive at different judgments regarding what's best for Britain. Those first few lines made the consequences crystal plain. Edward was tacitly establishing himself as a potential leader who could offer a different approach to the situation when he told a German official that Churchill's administration should be replaced with one that was more amenable to negotiating surrender. The three other letters that William read in rapid succession were all more unsettling than the previous one. The discussions Edward held with peace mediators in July 1940 were detailed in his writings. He had already begun to broach topics such as potential return to Britain in the event of peace negotiations, the fate of the British Empire, and the structure of government by August. By any measure, it did not amount to treason. Edward had abdicated as king, technically held no position requiring loyalty to the British government. However, it had a catastrophic impact on morality, politics, and history. As Britain battled for its very existence, here was a former monarch engaging in active cooperation with representatives of the enemy. During the Battle of Britain, Edward was in Lisbon, discussing capitulation conditions, while the RAF fought in the air and people suffered through the Blitz. Their emotions darken with each paper as William's assistant reads over his shoulder. Neither historical subtlety nor intricate interpretation was there. It was proof of teamwork in writing. Clarity, specificity, and detail characterized the letters. They showed that Edward was intent on undermining British resistance and was not content to be merely friendly to Nazi Germany. However, Edward's actions weren't the most heartbreaking part of the letter. His troublesome behavior throughout the war years has long been suspected by historians. The presence of other identities in the correspondence made these materials extremely combustible. Edward was not behaving unilaterally. Instead of continuing to quarrel with relatives who backed his stance, he decided to make peace with Hitler and corresponded with other British nobles who shared his views. A letter written by Edward in October 1940 made reference to discussions that his younger brother George, the Duke of Kent and the brother of the king, had with him. According to reports, George felt Edward's pain and thought Britain could have to negotiate terms if the United States did not join the war soon. George may have discussed the possibility of putting pressure on King George IV to re-evaluate his support for Churchill's government with other family members, according to the letter. After being hailed as a war hero, the Duke of Kent tragically passed away in a plane crash in 1942. Even after 8 decades, his reputation was untarnished. This letter hinted that his bravery throughout the war was more nuanced than first thought, and that he had at least contemplated endorsing his older brother's defiant stance. New names emerged. Aristocrats who were married into the present royal family and whose ancestors were still well known in Britain and held key seats in the House of Lords. Reputations in other fields would also take a hit if these letters were published. It would bring up scandals in the present day, make live people answer for the decisions their forebears made, and make us wonder if these views had endured through the years. William spent more than 2 hours reading his way through the entire collection. In all, Margaret had 57 letters covering a period of 2.5 years, according to her preliminary tally. November 1942 saw the abrupt and unexplained end of the correspondence. Somebody had either gathered these particular letters and stashed them away while erasing or destroying others, or Edward had stopped making copies. Among the collection's letters, the last one was the most terrifying. It was written by Edward and addressed to the middleman who had been easing his interactions with German authorities. The date was November 15, 1942. That the conflict was going on without any headway toward the negotiated end to hostilities was something that Edward was very frustrated about, and he vented his frustrations to the press. But before he ended, he said something that made William shudder. After all is all said and done, maybe history will reveal who looked out for Britain's best interests and who let Churchill's ego get in the way. It would appear that Edward thought, or at least pretended, that he had been attempting to rescue Britain from catastrophe as Churchill guided the country towards annihilation. There was an almost intolerable amount of historical irony. The British were spared by Churchill. Nazi Germany would have been able to subjugate England if Edward had negotiated a peace. Still, Edward was adamant that he had been correct and Churchill was mistaken, even as the tide was turning in 1942. William put the last letter aside and sat back to think about what he had read. With the knowledge that they had just been exposed to historical facts that could modify narratives about World War II and harm the monarchy's meticulously preserved reputation, his aides remained equally quiet. Margaret dared to ask the question that had been on everyone's mind. Could you please tell me what to do with these documents? They have remained hidden for more than 80 years due to apparent reasons. Must they be kept secret? Should institutions and their reputations be safeguarded by destroying them? Do you think they should be preserved but kept secret? Would historians benefit from having access to them if they were made public? There was no quick response from William. The historian in him thought it was important to keep records for future generations and make them available to scholars when the time was right. A part of his royal heritage told him that publishing the story would spark a firestorm of criticism and perhaps harm. Even though it was uncomfortable or hurtful, the truth was important, and the moral side of him knew that. But beyond the initial shock of revelation, he needed time to reflect, consult, and contemplate consequences. He gave Margaret explicit instructions to store the documents in a vault that could only be accessed by herself and him. These letters were to remain hidden from all others. No, not just yet. While he returned to London with copies of important documents for further study and advice from reliable sources, the originals would stay in Balmoral, securely stored away for the past 8 decades. William got ready to return to London as the sun rose over the Scottish Highlands. Uncertain of what he would discover, he had rushed to Scotland in a state of anxiety. He was departing with devastating knowledge, documentary evidence that his great-great-uncle had collaborated with Nazi Germany, that other relatives had contemplated or even supported that collaboration, and that the abdication crisis and war years were more morally compromised than official histories allowed. When he returned to London, he would face the difficult decision of whether to divulge some truths because of the damage they could do or because, in the interest of historical accuracy, it was imperative that he do so regardless of the potential fallout. William, who had little sleep on the way back from Aberdeen, returned to Kensington Palace on Wednesday afternoon for his consultation. Catherine had already dispatched the youngsters to their lessons and was waiting in their private sitting room. Throughout the night, she had fretted. William's abrupt exit and evasive explanation had hinted at a serious problem, not just a typical emergency. He watched as her face went from inquisitive to shocked to nearly horrified as she read Edward's casual talks of the British surrender on his encrypted tablet and showed her chosen photos of the letters. As a history major at St. Andrews, Catherine was familiar with the canonical accounts of the reign of the abdication and the years of war. The discovery of documentary proof that ran counter to their stories was deeply disturbing. She asked a pragmatic first inquiry. Was anyone else aware? William verified that the only people who had seen or heard of the documents were Margaret the archivist, his 2 assistants, and now Catherine. On purpose, the circle was tiny. The risk of exposure, whether intentional or not, rose with each more person brought in. The consequences were readily understood by Catherine's strategic intellect. Whether the monarchy had truly resisted Nazism or had protected defeists and collaborators during the war would be a matter of public debate if these letters were to become public knowledge. Not only would Edward's sentiments be criticized, but it would be even more devastating to learn that he had company, that other members of the royal and aristocratic families shared his views. It was especially troubling that the Duke of Kent seemed to be involved. His descendants remember him warmly. He was called after structures and foundations, and he was memorialized as a military hero. However, his defiant ideas would damage his legacy and the pride of his great-grandchildren and grandkids. Suppressing the documents, however, was not without its hazards. Williams would face catastrophic charges of cover-up in the event that they were unearthed by others or that his knowledge of them was later disclosed. As a whole, the monarchy would be associated with defending traitorous forebears and covering up historical facts in order to maintain honor. Compared to the harm that might result from being truthful, that damage might be greater. During the whole journey back, William struggled with this math. Disclosure and repression were both fraught with tremendous danger. Instead of a clear way forward, it seemed like you had to choose between many forms of damage. For advice on how to best maintain important institutions, he chose to speak with his father, King Charles, the one person in whose opinion he had complete faith. Regardless of the difficulties in their personal relationship, Charles had devoted decades of thought to the future of the monarchy. When it came to protecting institutions and also being truthful about the past, he had it figured out. That evening, at Clarence House, the meeting was scheduled. The only thing William informed Charles was that there was an important historical matter that needed to be discussed privately right now. Therefore, he brought the tablet with the photograph letters. Charles made sure everyone was alone by clearing his schedule. With no help from advisors or personnel, a father and son face a generational family catastrophe. With his usual reflectiveness, Charles read the chosen letters, pausing to reread portions or quietly scribbling notes as he went. At 76 years old, he had weathered the storms of royal scandals and crises with an expression that betrayed no surprise. The calculation, the weighing of ramifications and possibilities, was visible to William, but he was unsurprised. After finishing the book, Charles made his usual nuanced first observation. The letters were hurtful, no doubt about it, but the setting was crucial. They were penned by Edward between 1940 and 1942, when many astute observers saw Britain's situation as dire. It wasn't necessarily treacherous to think that a negotiated peace was better than the total collapse of the nation. It may have been defiant, but it was more driven by perceived practicality than malicious intent. That motivation didn't alter the essential fact, was William's counterargument. Edward had been collaborating with enemy officials to sabotage the war effort of his own country. It was at least considered by the Duke of Kent and others mentioned in the letters. Those weren't just gloomy predictions. Their goal was to make it easier for the British to surrender. Charles was aware of this, but he brought up earlier records that were comparable. The administration under Churchill was aware of Edward's troublesome correspondence. That is why he was removed from Europe as quickly as possible by being appointed governor of the Bahamas. It seems the authorities investigated treason charges against him, but ultimately determined the harm would be greater than the good. The decision to conceal these letters in particular implies that Churchill or someone in his inner circle saw the necessity to preserve documentary evidence rather than destroy or make public. They were kept hidden to avoid the scandal that would ensue if they were revealed, but they were also held as leverage in case Edward ever caused difficulties. After 8 decades, that choice had paid off. Now we needed to know if the circumstances of the 21st century called for a different kind of computation. For advice on dealing with sensitive information and constitutional crises, Charles recommended contacting the cabinet secretary, the highest-ranking government official. William, though, was adamant. There was an increase in exposure risk for everyone included in the circle. Government officials spent the evening debating and circling over ideas without achieving a consensus after realizing the material would inevitably leak, be the subject of FOIA requests, or be featured in someone's memoirs. I felt guilty for changing the past, but destroying the documents would solve the problem. Never let anyone see them. That amounted to keeping things as they were before, but now that more people know the secret, you let them go. While truthful from a historical perspective, that would be disastrous for institutions. At long last, Charles proposed a middle ground. Seek the advice of an impartial historian who could assess the reliability and relevance of the papers independently of their provenance or the involvement of the royal family. Give the impression that these letters were found quite recently and their origin is unknown. To gauge the potential effect of making them public, consult experts. Before making a decision based on scared conjecture instead of well-informed evaluation. William was concerned about keeping things under wraps, but he still thought this was a good strategy. The letters must have originated in the royal archives, as any historian worth his salt would recognize Edward's handwriting on them. The potential for word to spread appeared to be significant. A change was proposed by Catherine, who had been attentively listening to the argument. Why not display the letters to the head of the Imperial War Museum instead of consulting a historian? on a regular basis. The museum dealt with classified war documents and had processes in place to determine whether or not such records should be made public due to concerns about national security. So long as the director followed those guidelines, the royal family wouldn't have to make a unilateral decision. While Charles could see the reasoning, he did point out that involving any institution would result in a permanent record. It is possible that the director of the War Museum may be required to disclose the results of any evaluations conducted on these papers. There would be more people involved than the small group that is currently aware of this. No decisions were made at the end of the meeting. With a promise to give due consideration to all options before making a decision, William returned the tablet to Kensington. Whatever decision was taken, Charles stressed, had to have historical and institutional legs to stand on. They couldn't just put the family's honor first. Doing so would be unethical. The real harm that would be done to live individuals by exposing these letters to historical figures who had made awful decisions couldn't be ignored, either. As William slept that night, thoughts of his great-great-uncle Edward raced through his mind. As a romantic who relinquished his crown for love, had a life of happy exile, and had been more naive than wicked, history had been largely kind to him. It was a familiar and fairly innocuous story, though it was likely overly generous. That story would be irretrievably destroyed by the letters. It may have been politically and personally necessary for Edward to abdicate, as his ideas were fundamentally at odds with Britain's existence. But in the end, he would be remembered as a Nazi collaborator who deliberately worked against Britain during its darkest hour. Another person who would be tarnished by association is the Duke of Kent, who was William's great-great-uncle who died while serving. The names of the nobility that showed up in the letters would be revealed. There would be harm to families. An honor system that had been in place for decades would collapse. This was all because an archivist was just doing her job, taking stock of a long-neglected storage room, and discovered a box that someone had concealed on purpose but hadn't destroyed. William occasionally thought about how the past should remain in the past. However, no matter how thoroughly historical facts were buried, they eventually surfaced. With the fact captured on a protected tablet housed in a vault at Balmoral in his hands, he was faced with a decision that would shape his connection to the past, his integrity, and the organization he would one day head. 3 days after William returned from Balmoral, a reporter from The Guardian phoned the press office of Kensington Palace with an unusual question, adding additional pressure to the decision he had intended to make quietly. Was there an emergency that prompted the Prince of Wales' recent trip to Scotland? Was searching royal archives a part of this journey? Do you know anything about the link between this visit and whispers of hidden World War II documents? Someone had spoken, noticed, or established connections. But the inquiries were too general to give the impression that the reporter had only partial details. The claimed covert nighttime flight to Balmoral that Williams had planned hadn't gone off as well as he'd anticipated. The director of his communications fielded the call using the usual deflections. Nobody said anything about the Prince of Wales's personal schedule. There was no way to validate or deny any information regarding royal archives. Within the palace, alarm bells were ringing, but any official queries would be addressed through the right channels. William wasted no time in contacting Margaret at Balmoral. Had anyone else heard about the finding from her? But she denied it. William, his 2 assistants, and whomever William had informed later were the only ones who knew. She had taken his orders to heart, making sure the materials were locked up and not shared with anybody. Royal guards and secretaries had taken note of William's unexpected arrival and departure, though. There were flight records. Aircraft manifests were submitted. Some had seen parts of the picture, but no one had seen the whole thing. It seems that someone had pieced together enough information to make educated assumptions, which were then relayed to a journalist. Aside from the reporter from The Guardian, others also wanted to know something. In the following 2 days, 3 additional journalists from various news organizations asked comparable questions, approaching the subject from slightly different perspectives, but ultimately returning to the same central narrative. Something important enough to necessitate William's immediate personal attention had prompted him to discreetly go to Scotland to handle it in the archives. The plot was starting to work itself out. More questions were produced just by the fact that people were inquiring, even though no one leaked explicitly. The reason William had gone to Balmoral was now the subject of a media investigation, which was bringing to light whatever it was he had been attempting to conceal. William called a meeting of his senior advisors at Kensington Palace as a matter of urgency. Along with Catherine, he was accompanied by his communications director, 2 assistants who had gone to Scotland with him, and his private secretary. King Charles was conspicuously missing. William preferred to deal with the situation independently so as not to involve his father any further. Gloom was the general opinion. Something was bound to happen with the story. The bits had been observed by too many individuals. Evidently, something was in the works at The Guardian, likely for publishing this coming weekend. Once the first story went up, other publications would follow suit. Just a few more days of denial and redirection from the palace would suffice. But now was not the moment to keep this a secret at all costs. Now it was a matter of whatever version of the narrative the palace wanted told, rather than whether the story would become public or not. If they choose to remain silent, journalists would be free to assemble stories from incomplete sources, which might lead to inaccurate reporting and speculation. Alternately, companies might proactively disclose controlled information before the press imposes chaotic disclosure. The director of communications for Williams discussed the many alternatives for controlled disclosure. Make public an announcement verifying the discovery of historical records during ordinary archive procedures at Balmoral. Recognize that, because of the delicate nature of the documents, Prince William had personally examined them. Presented the ongoing historical evaluation as an excuse not to reveal the contents of the documents. The journalists would be able to validate their suspicions about the basic facts while still having some influence over the story. Another option would be for them to be more forthright. Let the public know that the letter exists and what it contains in general, and explain how you decided to make it public or not. Instead of painting it as a cover-up attempt, frame it as responsible management of history. Instead of making a judgment without consulting public historians, let them discuss what should be done. William found both choices to be challenging. The first one made it seem like the palace was trying to cover up something. That's why they wouldn't reveal the material until it was harmful. The second one was like willingly causing the very controversy he had been attempting to avoid. Nobody had mentioned a third alternative until Catherine did. What if, in the sake of complete transparency, they just made the letters public all at once? Name them and treat them with disdain. Show proper remorse for their actions, but be completely forthright instead of trying to conceal or downplay unpleasant realities. The room was taken aback by the suggestion. Without delay, William's personal secretary detailed the dangers. The disastrous effects on live descendants of individuals mentioned in the letters, the unchecked erosion of the monarchy's prestige, and the total lack of control over the story's framing were all entirely under management. However, Catherine's reasoning was persuasive. Any effort to keep important historical material under wraps ultimately backfired and made the eventual disclosure even more damaging. Eventually, the letters would make it into the public domain thanks to leaks, freedom of information requests, and investigative journalism. It would be preferable to release them willingly according to the palace's conditions rather than to have them exposed by hostile reporting. Her reasoning had some validity, but William was concerned about the consequences right away. Some letters linked the Duke of Kent with his great-great-uncle's Nazi activities, while others implied that the royal family was more divided than previously thought in its opposition to Hitler. The monarchy would be forced to confront unpleasant parts of its past if this knowledge were to be made public. Doing so would necessitate an explanation and an apology and would monopolize news cycles for weeks. But keeping the letters under wraps or releasing selectively edited excerpts seemed like an increasingly infeasible alternative. In any case, the news was about to be broken by The Guardian. It was being pursued separately by other journalists. The knowledge was already leaking out, and any efforts to stop it would only make the palace seem bad for covering it. The discussion carried over into the evening as well as the afternoon. The Williams advisors were divided. Some wanted Catherine to be more open and honest, while others preferred cautious and limited communication. Everyone seemed uneasy with every choice, which may have meant that there wasn't a clear winner, but that each option was challenging. Later that night, William gave his dad another call to fill him in on the latest developments with the press queries and the plans for responding. A measurable response emitted from Charles. Even in the face of humiliating historical truths, the monarchy had managed to survive, he pointed out. At the time, it appeared as though Wallis Simpson, Diana's murder, and Andrew's scandals could all prove to be fatal. Some mix of openness, adaptation, and time had allowed each to live. The idea that the family was attempting to conceal historical facts was Charles's greatest concern, even more so than the letter's actual contents. People had to think the monarchy was honest at its core if it admitted its mistakes instead of trying to hide them. If it didn't, it would fall. Worst case scenario, William tries to hide these letters and gets caught. To err on the side of openness was Charles's final piece of advice. Release the letters with proper context, convey adequate remorse, and have faith in the intelligence of the British people to distinguish between past mistakes and modern institutions. After more than half a century, Edward passed away. Dying in 1942 was the Duke of Kent. After their political opinions were debunked by history, the individuals mentioned in these letters disappeared. Although it was humiliating, the revelation of their words from 8 decades ago did not pose an existential threat. Though he absorbed his father's counsel, William was still unsure. With the knowledge that revealing the truths would hurt living relatives and ruin well-preserved historical narratives, the decision to reveal things that had been purposefully concealed for 8 decades felt monumental. However, he was unable to influence the outcome because of outside forces. The palace was notified on Friday evening that a story regarding William's clandestine journey to Balmoral and new World War II-related archival findings would be published on Sunday by The Guardian. The palace was given the opportunity to comment on the article before it was published. William had no say in whether or not the story broke. Instead of wondering if these letters will be made public, the focus shifted to how. William came to the inevitable realization that he had to make the choice to be transparent, rather than having it imposed on him by journalists. Before Saturday morning's publication of The Guardian Sunday, he gave the go-ahead to his communications director to draft a comprehensive response. The announcement would openly recognize the letter's discovery, provide an honest overview of their contents, and announce that, following appropriate conservation and authentication, they would be made available to historians and the public. A choice was reached. Now everyone would know about the tragic revelation he had flown to Scotland to look into. Even in its heyday, during World War II, the monarchy had hidden voices calling for capitulation and cooperation, which was an inconvenient reality that it would have to face. Final tally. At 8 in the morning on Saturday, Kensington Palace issued a statement that was candorful like never before. In contrast to the customary cautious palace language, which concealed more than it showed, this declaration was comprehensive and clear. It proved that Edward, Duke of Windsor, had correspondence that had been found before during ordinary archive work at Balmoral. These letters showed that while Britain was battling for its life, the ex-king was communicating with German officials and middlemen over possible negotiated peace. The letter demonstrated Edward's defiant position, his belief that the British resistance was futile, and his apparent efforts to assist negotiations regarding the terms of capitulation. Members of the royal family and the aristocracy were among the other names that featured in the letter, as recognized in the statement. The fact that these people had considered viewpoints that had been disastrously incorrect was conveyed with deep sadness. Edward was moved to the Bahamas, practically exiled, to prevent him from causing additional damage. It was reported that Churchill's government had clearly been aware of his troublesome contacts. Crucially, the announcement revealed that all of the letters would be digitized and made instantly accessible to certified historians, with public access to come following appropriate conservation. The palace had no intention of withholding or selectively disclosing this information. Being honest about unpleasant facts from the past was involved. An enormous and rapid response ensued. This was the lead story in news outlets around the world. It was headlined, "Royal Archives Reveal Edward VII's Nazi Collaboration" in the Times. The Guardian stated that the Duke of Windsor was complicit in the British defeat. Within hours, news outlets around the world began covering the story, which was subsequently translated into dozens of languages. The present royal dynasty was met with mixed reactions. William was lauded by numerous pundits for coming clean instead of trying to hide the truth. Historians praised the openness, saying that this was the way archives should work, by keeping historical truths intact regardless of how uncomfortable or unpleasant they may be. Many of the criticisms directed on Edward and the people mentioned in the letters were rather harsh. A reputation that was already tainted was now irrevocably stained on the Duke of Windsor's face. The gloomier reality replaced the idyllic story of the king who sacrificed everything for love. He had sinned against his own country throughout the war as a Nazi sympathizer. Within hours after the letter's digital dissemination, historians started studying them. Academics swiftly reached an agreement. Many had suspected but couldn't verify it until the letters verified it, that Edward had orchestrated the downfall of British resistance, going beyond mere sympathies with Nazi Germany. Given what was known about aristocratic defeatism, the news regarding the Duke of Kent was more surprising, but still not wholly so. Several universities and colleges planned conferences to discuss the letter's historical relevance in 1940. Book projects studying the ramifications of the correspondence were approached by publishers who were interested in historians. Scholars were re-evaluating the abdication problem and Britain's wartime politics, and the letters were no longer relegated to oblivion. Republicans sought to use the news to their advantage, claiming it demonstrated the monarchy's inherent inadequacy for its constitutional function. However, there was little support for the argument. It seems that the majority of people can tell the difference between the values of modern institutions and the shortcomings of historical personalities. Since the present royal family opted for openness rather than secrecy, they could not be held accountable for Edward's actions 80 years earlier. William went back to Balmoral a month after the find to see Margaret Thornhill, the archivist whose usual inventory work had set off the whole issue. During that time, she had to deal with an avalanche of requests for interviews and access from historians and journalists, as well as a review of security standards to make sure no more explosive material was hiding in the archives. William commended her for exercising restraint while first dealing with the revelation. The letters could have been presented to co-workers or casually brought up, allowing the material to leak in an uncontrolled manner. The palace was able to take its time making disclosure decisions because she recognized the document's sensitivity right away and decided to contact William immediately. Margaret wanted to know if William felt bad about her finding. The letters might still be hidden today, 80 years from now, or forever if she hadn't been cleaning out that storage area. Is it possible that their disappearance would have been preferable? William gave serious thought to the subject before answering. Hiding historical truths was eventually destructive. Even though the letters' discovery had been traumatic, produced difficulties, and destroyed historical reputations. Uncomfortable details regarding the monarchy's involvement in the conflict were exposed by the records. By excluding Edward and siding with Churchill, they proved that the institution had made the right decision in the end. There would have been substantially more harm done had the letters stayed secret and been found by unfriendly journalists or Republican activists. A possible scandal was transformed into an example of institutional integrity when the palace took charge of the story and willingly released them. A potential institutional disaster may have ensued had Prince William not secretly departed for Scotland after the discovery of incendiary letters written during the conflict. His unparalleled candor was on display instead when he decided to release the papers that exposed Edward VII and his family's involvement with the Nazis. Truthfulness, responsibility, and moral bravery are the qualities that have allowed modern monarchies to endure, as William demonstrated by facing unpleasant historical facts head-on instead of avoiding them. It is necessary to reveal some secrets,